Okay, let's unpack this. You eat food every single day, obviously. It's just this fundamental automatic part of life. But have you ever really stopped to think about the absolutely wild journey that food takes through your body? From the moment it enters your mouth to when your cells finally get those crucial nutrients.
It feels simple, right?
Right.
Because your body just
Uh,
does it automatically. It's all perfectly timed, incredibly precise. But yeah, underneath that, there's this whole cascade of mechanical movements, complex chemical reactions, all run by this network of nerves and hormones. It's quite something.
And that is exactly what this deep dive is all about today. We've got a whole stack of sources here, diagrams, figures, some really detailed passages. They cover everything from, like, the first swallow right down to the nitty-gritty of how cells absorb stuff. So our mission is to really dig into these materials. We want to highlight the automatic and often kind of surprising ways your body moves, breaks down, and absorbs everything you eat, and show it just how complex this everyday thing truly is. So the journey kicks off, naturally, with ingestion, taking food in. And yeah, hunger and appetite dictate what and how much we eat, but let's jump right into the mechanics of what happens next. Specifically, swallowing, that pharyngeal stage.
Right, and this stage is lightning fast. We're talking less than a second, really. As food hits the back of your throat, the pharynx, a whole series of, like, protective actions just kick in automatically. First thing, your soft palate lifts up. That's to stop food going up into your nasal cavity.
Yeah, good plan. Nobody wants food up there.
Yeah, exactly. Then these folds on the sides, the peltopharyngeal folds, they move inward towards each other. This creates a kind of narrow slit. And here's something cool, a bit of built-in wisdom. This slit acts like a filter, mostly lets through food that's been chewed enough. Smaller bits pass easily, bigger chunks can get held back a bit.
Huh. So like a quality control check right
Yeah.
there in the swallow itself. That's fascinating. What else happens in that split second?
Well, at the same time, and this is crucial, your vocal cords slam shut really tightly, and your voice box, the larynx, gets pulled up and forward. These movements, plus the epiglottis sort of tipping back over the opening, it all protects your airway. People often focus on the epiglottis, but the sources suggest it's really that tight closure of the vocal cords that's the most critical step, making sure food goes down the esophagus, not the windpipe.
Right, so it's not just a simple flap. It's a whole coordinated defense system for your breathing tube. And you said this whole complex sequence, the entire swallow, takes less than 6 seconds total.
For the whole process, yeah. The pharyngeal part itself is under a second. And what's really striking is how breathing fits in, or doesn't, rather.
Yeah.
The swallowing center in your brainstem actually tells your respiratory center, hey, hold up a sec. It pauses breathing just for that moment during the pharyngeal stage. It happens so fast you barely notice, even if you're mid-sentence. Swallowing safety takes priority.
Amazing. Okay, so from the pharynx, the food gets pushed down the esophagus by peristalsis, those muscle waves we see in the diagrams, and then plop into the stomach, which isn't just a bag, right? It's a mixer, an early digester.
Oh, absolutely. The stomach is seriously dynamic. It has these distinct mechanical actions. First, there's propulsion. Peristaltic waves push the food down towards the exit, the pylorus.
But it doesn't just shoot right out.
No, definitely not most of it. Because that pylorus, that muscular valve at the bottom, stays pretty tightly closed, especially when there's solid food.
Yeah.
So most food particles are too big to get through initially. They get trapped in the lower part of the stomach, the antrum. And there, the muscle contractions really churn it intensely. That's the grinding action. Then, the stuff that couldn't pass gets squeezed back up into the main body of the stomach. That's called retropulsion. The diagrams show these three things: propulsion, grinding, retropulsion, all happening together. It mixes things incredibly well.
Wow, so it's like a high-powered, intelligent blender,
Yeah.
constantly mixing and remixing until things are small enough to pass the pyloric gate. Now, let's switch to the chemical side. Hydrochloric acid, HCl. We know it's strong, but these sources, they show just how extreme it is.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. The parietal cells in the stomach lining pump out HCl. The pH can get down to 0.8.
0.8, that's insanely acidic. How does the stomach itself survive that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources give some insight. I mean, the concentration of hydrogen ions in that acid is about 3 million times higher than in your blood. Think about that. And making that acid costs a ton of energy for those cells, over 1,500 calories per liter of gastric juice. They manage it and protect themselves using these incredibly specialized protein pumps and channels in their membranes. especially pumps that push hydrogen ions out against that massive gradient, while other channels manage potassium and sodium to keep the cell balanced.
So these tiny cells are basically running little energy-guzzling acid factories while simultaneously building fortresses against their own product. It's
A
fascinating.
biochemical marvel.
And what tells the stomach to start all this churning and acid making?
It's from the food itself, chemicals in the food, and the stomach stretching as it fills up. These trigger receptors in the stomach wall, which activate local nerve reflexes and also send signals up the vagus nerve. That stimulates the muscles and the acid secretion. But interestingly, the sources mentioned that things like, major emotional stress or activating your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response, that can actually override these normal digestive signals. It can slow things down or mess with secretion.
So that totally explains why stress can give you an upset stomach. It's literally interfering with the control system. And that graph showing stomach emptying times, it really highlights how the stomach regulates its output. Like simple saline just flows through much faster than a complex meal that needs all that grinding. Okay, so after its time getting churned and acidified in the stomach, the food, now this thick liquid called chyme, moves into the small intestine. And this is where the real heavy lifting happens, right? The vast majority of digestion and absorption.
This is absolutely the main event. The small intestine, it just brilliantly designed for absorption. Its inner surface isn't smooth at all. It's covered in millions and millions of these tiny finger-like projections called villi. Each one's only about a millimeter tall.
I've seen those diagrams. Yeah, they look like a sort of dense carpet or forest.
Exactly like that. And that structure is absolutely key. These villi increase the surface area available for absorption by a massive amount, something like 10 times what it would be if it were just a flat tube. And the wall diagrams show the different layers involve the mucosa with the villi, the submucosa underneath, the muscle layers, all working together.
Okay, so let's talk about how different nutrients actually get absorbed across this huge surface area. And to do that, we need some help from the neighbors, right? The liver, gallbladder, pancreas.
Absolutely essential neighbors. The liver is constantly making bile, which is crucial for handling fats. You can see in the diagrams how bile flows from the liver cells through tiny little ducts. This bile then gets shunted over to the gallbladder, that little sac tucked under the liver where it's stored and concentrated.
And the gallbladder just squeezes it out when needed, like when you eat fatty food.
Precisely. The number one trigger for the gallbladder to contract and squirt that concentrated bile into the small intestine is a hormone called CCK. CCK gets released when fatty food arrives from the stomach. There are also nerve signals involved, acetylcholine from the vagus nerve and local nerves. Bile then acts basically like a detergent. It breaks down large fat globules into tiny little droplets. It's called emulsification. Makes it much easier for enzymes to attack the fat.
Right, like dish soap breaking up grease on a plate.
Yeah.
And the pancreas, that brings the enzymes.
Yes, the pancreas is the enzyme powerhouse. It makes this cocktail of really potent digestive enzymes in its acinar cells. These enzymes get secreted into the small intestine, and they break down carbohydrates, proteins, and fats into smaller units that can actually be absorbed. And just like the gallbladder, the pancreas gets stimulated to release its enzymes by hormones like CCK and also by nerve signals when food shows up.
Okay, so you've got bile breaking up fats, pancreatic enzymes chopping everything up, plus some enzymes right there on the intestine wall. How do things actually get into the body? Let's start simple. Water.
Water's absorption is relatively straightforward compared to the others. It's pure osmosis. Water just follows the concentration gradients. It moves from an area where solutes are less concentrated to where they're more concentrated. So if really concentrated chyme, say from a sugary drink, hits the intestine, water will actually get pulled out of your bloodstream into the gut initially to dilute it. But generally, as the solutes, the digested food bits get absorbed into your body, water just follows them right along from the gut lumen into the cells and then the blood.
It makes sense. Follow the crowd. What about carbs, sugars, starches?
Carbs get partly broken down in the lumen, but the final critical step happens right at the surface of the intestinal cells. There are special enzymes embedded in the cell membrane in what's called the brush border. Enzymes like sucrase isomaltase, they chop disaccharides and oligosaccharides, slightly bigger sugar molecules, down into single sugar units, things like glucose and fructose. Then, these single sugars need specific protein doorways or transporters like SGLT1 and GLUT2 shown in the diagrams to get across the cell membrane into the intestinal cell, and then another transporter to get out the other side into the bloodstream.
So enzymes on the outside, specific doors to get inside. Got it. How about proteins?
Proteins get broken down, mainly by pancreatic enzymes in the lumen, into their basic building blocks, amino acids, and also some small peptides, which are just short chains of a few amino acids. Then, these amino acids and small peptides are absorbed using different sets of transporter proteins on the intestinal cell surface. It's interesting, the sources mention that while cells can take up some whole proteins by endocytosis, like engulfing them, about 90% of those proteins actually get broken down inside the cell before they enter the bloodstream. The body really prefers the individual amino acids. And the data shows different absorption rates for single amino acids versus those dipeptides, suggesting slightly different handling mechanisms.
Like your body wants to build with individual Lego bricks, not bigger pre-assembled chunks.
Okay.
And fats, the tricky ones that needed the bile.
Fats are definitely the most complex because, well, oil and water don't mix, right? So after bile emulsifies them and pancreatic lipase breaks them down into free fatty acids and something called 2-monoisoglycerol or 2-mag, these components team up with bile salts to form these tiny structures called mixed micelles. You can think of micelles as little transport pods like ferry boats. They carry the fatty bits across the watery layer right next to the intestinal cell surface. The fatty acids in 2-mag then just diffuse out of the micelle and slip right into the cell membrane and into the cell. But here's the wild part. Once inside the cell, the body immediately rebirths them back into triglycerides, the main storage form of fat. This happens in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. These newly made fat droplets that get packaged up and released into the lymphatic system, not directly into the blood like sugars and amino acids. The diagram showing the fat structures really help visualize this.
Wow. Taken apart to cross the barrier, then immediately put back together inside. That is wild. And beyond the big three nutrients, the sources also mention how incredibly specific some absorption is, like for vitamins.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Vitamins like folate and especially vitamin B12 have these really unique, quite elaborate absorption pathways. Folate, for example, is often eaten in complex forms, these thyroid polyglutamates. Enzymes have to chop off bits before the core part can be absorbed. And vitamin B12 is a fantastic example of complexity. It absolutely requires a special protein called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is actually secreted way back up in the stomach by those same parietal cells that make acid.
The acid-making cells also make the B12 escort.
That's right. B12 binds to intrinsic factor in the stomach and upper small intestine. Then this whole B12 intrinsic factor package travels all the way down to the very end of the small intestine, the ileum. And only there are there specific receptors designed to grab this complex and pull it into the cell. It even needs other binding proteins inside the cell, like transcobalamin II, to get processed and finally enter the bloodstream. It's this multi-step, highly targeted journey.
So something you ate needs help from the stomach to be absorbed hours later way down at the finish line. That's incredible coordination. Okay, and finally, one really striking detail in the sources involves cholera toxin, how it kind of demonstrates the power of messing with these transport systems.
Yeah, cholera toxin is a really grim but powerful illustration of what happens when intestinal fluid balance goes haywire. The toxin basically hijacks the signaling pathways inside the intestinal cells. It forces them to pump out massive amounts of chloride ions and sodium ions into the gut lumen. It does this by messing with a molecule called cyclic AMP, which then forces open chloride channels and activates pumps that push ions out. And wherever ions go, water follows.
Leading to that horrific, life-threatening diarrhea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You get this rapid, massive loss of fluid and electrolytes. We're talking 5, even 10 liters a day.
Yeah.
It causes severe dehydration, which is what's fatal if it's not treated. Ironically, from the bacteria's point of view, this huge flush helps spread them to new hosts. But the life-saving treatment is actually remarkably simple. Just give the patient saline solution, replace the water and salts they're losing faster than they're losing them, keep them hydrated while their body fights off the infection. It just underscores how critical that fluid and electrolyte balance is and how hijacking just one part of that absorption and secretion machinery can be catastrophic.
Okay, so we've traced food from that super fast, quality check swallow through the powerful acidic grinding of the stomach into the huge absorptive landscape of the small intestine, helped out by the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, where specialized enzymes break things down and these incredibly specific doorways and ferry boats and escorts get nutrients into the body. It's this seamless, automatic dance of mechanics and chemistry, all orchestrated by nerves and hormones that most of the time we don't even consciously register.
It really is a marvel of biological engineering humming away inside us constantly.
And it leaves you with this thought, doesn't it, when you think about how quickly food zips through some early stages, like that pharyngeal swallow. But then how long and complex the chemical breakdown and absorption is later on across maybe 20 feet of intestine. How does the body manage to perfectly time and regulate that entire journey, coordinating all these different organs and processes to make sure it wrings out the maximum nutrition without, getting all backed up or rushing things through too fast? That's the real puzzle the sources make you appreciate, I think. How does it all stay so perfectly synchronized?